Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Scouting for Growth podcast. Today, we have a unique guest whose work is at the forefront of a groundbreaking movement that is transforming personal and professional development across the globe. Joining us today is Paul F. Austin, a pioneer in the world of psychedelics and a leading voice in leveraging these substances for intentional personal growth and enhanced leadership. As the founder of Third Wave, Paul has built an educational platform that has reached millions, providing comprehensive resources on the safe and effective use of psychedelics. His innovative approach has been featured in prominent publications like Forbes, Rolling Stone, and the BBC's Work Life, highlighting his influence on modern leadership and entrepreneurship. Paul's mission centers around the concept of microdosing and the intentional use of psychedelics to unlock human potential. And he also believes that when used responsibly, psychedelics can be powerful tools to enhance creativity, improve communication, and foster innovation. His work empowers entrepreneurs, executives, and creatives to break through personal barriers and elevate their professional performance. In addition, through the Third Wave, actually, Paul is the founder of the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. Very important to highlight that here now, where he provides comprehensive training programs for professionals eager to integrate psychedelics practices into their professional offerings. He's also the author of Mastering Microdosing that you can find on Amazon. The most comprehensive guide actually on the subject, covering everything from protocols and benefits to potential challenges and sourcing. So when you think about Paul's journey, it is inspiring as he differentiates himself from many other professionals I've interviewed so far, right? Hailing from the Midwest of the United States, he began actually exploring potential of psychedelics when he was 19. His global experience living, working, and traveling the world include countries like Turkey, Thailand, Portugal, Mexico, the Netherlands, with no doubt, having given him his richness of perspective and, all the thought that he actually brings to his work and his teaching. So today, Paul is joining me to talk about how psychedelics are revolutionizing personal transformation and professional success. We will explore how these tools can be harnessed to navigate the complexities of leadership, spur innovation, and drive growth in both personal and entrepreneurial lives. We will also dive into the implication for the corporate world, right? Insurers and pharmaceutical companies. So, without further ado, let's welcome to the Scouting for Growth podcast, the visionary founders of Third Waves and advocate of intentional psychedelic use. His name is Paul Austin. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Sabine. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I appreciate
great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining me on Scouting for Growth to talk about one of those topics which are in, out, I don't know, right? Psychedelics. Right. So hopefully will be a great conversation. And to get started, tell us about you, where you come from, and what got you into psychedelics.
So I grew up in a small town, a middle-class family in West Michigan, which is in the Midwest. It's a pretty traditional part of the United States. And I grew up in a place where psychedelics and cannabis and other, illicit substances were frowned down upon, for lack of a better term. But at the age of 16, as I started my own process of individuation and coming into really starting to know myself, I had a really close friend who introduced me to cannabis at the age of 16, and I started to experiment a little bit with cannabis. And soon after that, my parents found out that I had been smoking cannabis. They sat me down one Sunday after church, very disappointed. They really couldn't believe that I would use an illicit drug like marijuana. And my dad looked at me and said, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident about 30 years prior to that, right? So it was clearly an impactful experience for them. It was also an impactful experience for me. And the lesson that I brought out of that was I am becoming someone that who does certain things that may not be acceptable in the environment and the community that I was raised in. Now, a few years later, that same friend who introduced me to cannabis introduced me to psilocybin mushrooms. I was 19 at the time. And through the age of 19, 20, 21, while I was in university, I started to experiment with some of these psychedelic substances. And cannabis was interesting. It helped me to laugh. It helped me to find social connection, but it wasn't nearly as profound and life-changing as my early experiences with psychedelics. And sort of the core insight that I got from those experiences was life is what you make of it. We're all just sort of making it up as we go along. There's massive creative potential. So live life on your own terms, how you want to live. And so that inspired me after university to travel, to move abroad, where I taught English in Turkey for a year. And while teaching English, this is in 2012, 2013, a lot of the conversations about becoming a digital nomad started to surface. So you can have an online business, you can work from anywhere. And so soon after that, I moved to Budapest, started to experiment with microdosing, which we'll talk more about on the episode today, taking very low doses of psychedelics 2 or 3 times a week, and found that it really helped me to stop drinking alcohol and find more flow and creativity in my everyday life. And so in 2015, I started an educational platform called Third Wave because at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of great educational information on the internet about psychedelics. And I wanted to create a platform where people could learn about it. They could learn about the history, they could learn about the scientific research that was starting to come out about psychedelics, and they could also learn about the risks. So they could, if they worked with psychedelics, they could use it safely and effectively. And now over the last 10 years, I've been professionally involved in this space as an entrepreneur. And I find that when psychedelics are done with intention, with responsibility, in a safe way, they can have really productive outcomes for those who choose to take them or work with them.
Yeah, so I just want to also make sure that we highlight that, some of those drugs have been available and also legal in countries like Holland, and a number of states,
Mm-hmm.
right, in the United States are making
Mm-hmm.
those also legal, either for personal consumption, like gummies in the United States, and then medical consumptions as well. So as we go into that, actually, Paul, what actually shaped your vision around psychedelic in your industry, and what got you to become a pioneer into that field?
That's a great question. So a lot of it, I believe, was a first mover advantage. When I started Third Wave in 2015, it was still highly stigmatized. There weren't a lot of people who understood some of the benefits and risks. So simply by being a first mover, starting a platform that had a lot of free content, free education, I even, started my own podcast in 2016 that allowed me to help steward people as they started to come into the space. And my focus at that time was mostly on microdosing. And so microdosing, just a little bit of backstory, microdosing is a fairly nascent version of psychedelic use. It wasn't really talked about until 2011, whereas high doses of psychedelics have been historically used for thousands of years in ancient Greece, ancient India, in the Amazon, and various other places. And so when microdosing came on the scene in 2011, Tim Ferriss, who's a really well-known podcaster, started to talk about it in 2015. And so I started Third Wave right after that, focused a lot on microdosing because my intention has always been to make psychedelic accessible to more people. And so I always thought of microdosing as it's like taking jumping in the shallow end of a pool before you jump in the deep end, or taking a small step before you take a big step. And even recent research has shown that in Oregon, which is one of the states in the US that has legalized psilocybin mushrooms, 75% of people who microdose end up going on to try higher doses of psychedelics because they can have a more transformative impact overall. I think the other thing that really helped was a lot of my work has been mission driven. So although I'm an entrepreneur and I have a team and I'm looking at top line revenue and expenses and having to manage all that, for me, a lot of this work is more from a social impact perspective. And considering the current climate that we live in, specifically, how we're very disconnected from the natural environment, and so we've seen the negative consequences of that. What I noticed early on in my psychedelic experiences is when people would have this experience, they would feel deeply connected to the natural environment. And so part of my mission and my impetus behind all this work has been, what if there was a tool like psychedelics that, if used with intention and responsibility, could help us wake up to the fact that how we relate to the environment is also how we relate to ourselves. And so the larger mission that I was really driven by was, how do we really step into this mode of regeneration, environmental regeneration, and how can psychedelics help leaders to recognize this and start to have companies and organizations that try to exist in harmony with the natural environment rather than against the natural environment. And so those two things, I think, have helped me to communicate and educate and guide people to a lot of healing and personal growth by working with these substances.
Yeah, I hear a lot of, trying to work toward acceptance. I think we are still going through a lot of biases in the world around when we think about psychedelics and specific, I would say, specific drugs, right? And so I would like to go into that. But first, you have made a point around, I guess, mental health, the fact that since COVID-19, our work life has changed. And so we've been flexible working, we've been remote working, we are working hybrid. And I just read an article actually a few moments ago, Paul, where companies are trying to get back people into the office by 2026 to actually make sure we are driving that top line, right? But I think it's an interesting angle because you're actually mentioning the fact that we must be more aligned to nature and life, right? Finding that work-life balance. You mentioned being digital nomad. I think there's 50, 60 million of digital nomads around the globe trying to find that balance around their work life and actually delivering value and making an income, but in a way they want to achieve their specific outcome. So going back to our conversation around psychedelic, I would like you to define things a little bit for us, because I think otherwise we are going to mix everything together. A friend of mine asked me 2 weeks ago to watch a program called, How to Change Minds, looking at 4 different drugs, right? LSD, MDMA, which is ecstasy. There was a psychedelic, which was a mushroom, and then one called mesca something. I'm so sorry. I'm uneducated, but I'm sure you're going to correct me. So I would like some definition, and so to actually help people to really understand what we are talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you mentioned the COVID-19, kind of epidemic. What's really fascinating about psychedelics is in the United States, there was a 4x increase from 2019 to 2023 of people who took psychedelics because as we were at home, a lot of people started to do ketamine therapy. So ketamine is one of the most common psychedelics. It's technically a dissociative, but it's legal almost anywhere. And then also a lot of people started to microdose with psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. So the word psychedelic comes from 2 Greek words, psyche and delos. So psyche means mind, delos means manifesting. And so the idea behind a psychedelic is that it helps to manifest the entire mind, not just the conscious mind, because only about 7% of our awareness is in the conscious mind. But what it does is it opens up our subconscious and our unconscious mind as well. And that's why people are finding a lot of efficacy specifically for healing clinical indications or even for creativity, because a lot of our stories, emotions, memories are stored in that subconscious or unconscious mind. And so psychedelics open up a space be able to process those things and heal those things. Now, there's sort of three main categories of psychedelics. So one are something called tryptamines, and tryptamines are things like psilocybin mushrooms, uh, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is also in ayahuasca, a tea that is used in the Amazon. There's also something called lysergamides. So lysergamides are LSD is the most common lysergamides. And then there's one called phenethylamines. And phenethylamines are things like MDMA and mescaline. So three main categories: tryptamines, lysergamides, phenethylamines. And what is sort of common across all three of these is how they interact on the brain. That a lot of the drugs that we think of, like cocaine and heroin or opiates and crystal meth, these highly addictive, illegal, and dangerous drugs, they're largely active on the dopamine system, which is why they're so addictive in many cases. Psychedelics act on the serotonin system instead of the dopamine system, largely. I mean, they touch other neurotransmitters as well, but it's largely serotonin. And so for that reason, they're not only not addictive, they're highly anti-addictive. In other words, clinical research has shown that they can help heal addictions like nicotine addiction or alcoholism or even opiate addiction. And so the commonality across these psychedelics is the impact on the serotonin system. And then what that does is it opens up the mind to be able to process things that would normally not be in our normal everyday waking consciousness.
Yeah, when I actually watched this program, which I thought was really revealing, we were dealing with people with cancer, right? Who had to actually accept the fact that they are probably terminal cancer. And going through some of those treatments, they were able to accept the outcome, but also deal with it, which I thought was fascinating when you start dealing with really terminal diseases, actually. So going back to psychedelics, Paul, it is a radical departure from traditional mental health programming or the way we actually do treatments. And I'm insurance, so I'm sure there are going to be a lot of insurance people listening to that. It's like, Sabine, what are you doing? But let's go for it. So how do you believe, those conventional way for us to deal with mental health can be dealt with psychedelics? And you said it's non-addictive. So what is changing in the world? Because those were banned. I mean, a lot of those were banned in the 70s, actually.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's really interesting when we look at how psychedelics interact with the brain and the body compared to traditional psychiatric medications like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Ritalin, Adderall, these medications that are for depression, ADHD, anxiety, that if you start to study some of the research behind psychiatric medications, a lot of the foundational philosophy for those is really treating the brain like a biochemical machine. And so the assumption was that, okay, if we just tweak serotonin with these SSRIs, these antidepressant medications, or if we just tweak dopamine with these ADHD medications, then it'll sort of fix the symptoms that someone is having. And oftentimes it can help address those surface symptoms, but psychiatric medications are not efficacious at getting below the symptoms and actually treating the root cause. And a lot of the root causes of clinical health conditions like depression, addiction, PTSD, even ADHD, they tend to come from early childhood traumatic experiences. So in the 90s, there was a measurement that was created called the ACE score, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what they found is that when someone had a higher number for that ACE score, they were much more likely to struggle with addiction, depression, anxiety, PTSD. So these would be things like not having a loving and caring parent, or suffering from abuse of some sort, or having an alcoholic parent, that it was much more likely that the individual would have a clinical condition. And so what psychedelics do is, instead of treating the symptom, sort of like a Band-Aid, they actually go to the root cause. And so especially when we're working with higher doses of psychedelics, which what I always communicate is it's really important to do that with a therapist, a coach, a guide. You want a professional practitioner who is there with you and supporting you, especially if you're quite new to this. It's not all that safe to just do a bunch of mushrooms at home by yourself. You really want professional guidance if you're going into this. And so what it does, as I mentioned before, is it sort of opens up the mind. And so a lot of these traumatic things that have happened to us are stored in our subconscious or unconscious. And so psychedelics open up a space where we can actually have a catharsis. We can process those traumatic things. We can bring them to the surface. We can forgive ourselves. We can love ourselves in that process. And what people have noticed is, there have been folks who have been on antidepressants for 20 or 30 years, and they're just sort of in that state of things are fine. They're not bad, but they're not great. There's this feeling of what's called anhedonia, where everything is just sort of gray or blah. And what psychedelics do is they actually bring you deeper into the emotional body. They allow you to experience not only bliss and joy, but also maybe the anger or sadness or grief that has been repressed and under the surface. And that allows for a much richer experience of feeling and processing. And so clinical research shows that, I mean, you mentioned, for example, those who have clinical indications or cancer, where they might be on their deathbed. The reason psychedelics are so helpful at that is because they help to quell the fear and the anxiety that comes from dying. And the reason for that is because one of the things that psychedelics do is they create something called ego dissolution. And so when we dissolve the ego, when we interrupt our default patterns of living, all of a sudden we realize that, oh, I'm not just the personality of Paul Austin. I'm actually part of something much greater than myself. And so that can also help to quell this fear of dying, because so many of us are entrenched in the me, my, I. And when we take a psychedelic, it opens us up into this greater understanding of, oh, I'm part of this massive sort of organism and I'm important, but life will continue on. And my essence or soul or whatever you want to call it will also sort of continue on from there. So it's part spirituality, but also, as I've already talked about with mental health, there are very clear and productive ways where it can help people who have been depressed or addicted or anxious for a very long time.
It's interesting, right? Because we are working and living in a world that has been in some way disconnected when you think about COVID-19. But a lot of work I'm doing is around partnership and collaboration. And I wonder whether everybody I'm working with should be taking a little bit of psychedelic to actually feel the love and the trust, within the ecosystem to actually get the job done. Anyhow, that's just a side note. But on a serious note, actually, Paul, is, how do we know what to use? Because you mentioned quite a few different psychedelic, and my mind, I thought psychedelic were just about mushrooms, but earlier you mentioned other different substances, which applies within this psychedelic group, which actually start dealing with depression, PTSD, addiction, ADHD, amongst others. So, and you also mentioned ayahuasca. So it would be great to understand, how do you know what to use? And tell us a little bit more of what this ayahuasca tea you mentioned earlier might be.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about ayahuasca. So the way I look at psychedelics is like a skill. So just like we can learn to become a better writer, a better reader, we can learn to play a musical instrument, we can learn a martial art, right? Learning to work with psychedelics is a skill that we cultivate over time. So when you're first learning to cook, you don't have this expectation that you're going to cook a 5-course Michelin star meal for a group of 20 people. You might learn a recipe or 2 or 3 that you make for yourself and sort of start easy and go onwards from there. So thinking of it as a skill, what I always recommend is to start low and go slow. You can always take more. You can't necessarily take less, right? And so the substance that then an individual will start with will partly depend on where they live. So as we talked about already, Places like Colorado and Oregon have legal psychedelics. The Netherlands and Jamaica have legal psilocybin mushrooms. Costa Rica and other countries in South America, like Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, also have some of these legal psychedelics available. So if someone wants to fully stay on the right side of the law, they don't want to break any laws, then they often have to travel to one of these places. And so the substance they often use most commonly is psilocybin mushrooms because it's legal in the Netherlands, it's legal in Jamaica, it's legal in Colorado and Oregon. So that's what I found to be the substance that most people start with. Now, if someone is living, let's say, I live in California as an example, I live in San Diego. A lot of people here are actually growing their own psilocybin mushrooms. Even on Third Wave, we have a mushroom grow kit that people can access. Now, in most places, this is still illegal. However, in the United States, we have very strong protections over personal property and personal homes. And so there are a lot of people who are just starting to grow their own medicine, who are microdosing it, who are utilizing it. So that, I would say, the first category is mushrooms and starting at a microdose level, right? Starting low, going slow. That might be 100 milligrams of psilocybin mushrooms, which is about a tenth of a regular dose, of a dose that would make you start to have changes in your perception and your visual field and your emotional body. Now, the other main substance that I already mentioned is ketamine. And ketamine has been used in clinical research for suicidality and depression, and in places like the UK, in mainland Europe, in the United States and Canada, ketamine is legally available by prescription. And so there's even a major pharmaceutical company, Johnson & Johnson, that has patented a form of ketamine. And they, in fact, did over $1 billion in sales this year alone for ketamine specifically. So ketamine is also another great starting option. The experience lasts anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. So it's fairly short. People experience immediate benefit from it. And it's a really great starter for folks who are wanting to explore the space a little bit more. Ayahuasca is a little bit more advanced. I would say ayahuasca is sort of like the brown belt or black belt of psychedelics. And so it has a rooting in the Amazon. It's made in the Amazon. There are indigenous peoples that have used ayahuasca for over 1,000 years. But it requires a lot more preparation. The experience itself can be very, very intense and overwhelming. Sometimes people experience what they call purging, which is, vomiting, because that's part of the healing process. And it's often best done with shamans, or what are called curanderos or curanderas, which are healers in indigenous places. And so that will usually require traveling down to the Amazon or maybe Costa Rica. There are a number of retreat centers in Costa Rica now, and working with that medicine. But usually what I advise people is that's something to explore maybe year 3, year 4, year 5. Like I didn't work with ayahuasca myself until my 7th or 8th year of working with psychedelics. I started with mushrooms. I explored LSD. I explored MDMA as well, and ayahuasca was a little bit farther on. So I feel like that's an important part of this perspective is ayahuasca requires a lot more preparation. There are also more contraindications with ayahuasca, meaning if someone is on an SSRI or a certain psychiatric medication, those cannot be mixed. Whereas if someone is on an SSRI and they're looking for relief, you can actually take ketamine while you're still on an SSRI. But what I emphasize with this is always check with a medical professional, talk to your psychiatrist, talk to your psychiatric nurse, your clinical therapist, because it does require professional support if you want to do something like that.
So let's talk about microdosing and how that came about, because I think, like you said, during COVID-19, we've seen much more legal application of microdosing vis-a-vis traditional views around, how we medicate and how we do therapy with people. So what it is, what are the ingredients of microdosing, and, how easy or legal is it to do microdosing today?
Yeah, microdosing came about, as I mentioned, with this book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, in 2011, which was written by a guy named Dr. James Fadiman. James Fadiman is a mentor of mine. He's a clinical psychologist. He, in fact, is in his late 80s now and was involved in the 60s. as a researcher, the first time he ever did mushrooms was with Ram Dass in Paris, in fact. And so Jim is he brought this into the lexicon and into the culture. And the idea with microdosing is that instead of doing one very high dose, and you do it once, and it's profound, it's transformative, it's intense. Microdosing is taking a very, very small dose, what we call a sub-threshold dose of a psychedelic, most commonly psilocybin mushrooms or LSD, and you do it 2 or 3 times per week for anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. And what people notice after they do a full microdosing protocol is they tend to have a better mood, they tend to have more energy, and they tend to get better sleep, interestingly enough. And a lot of that efficacy comes after the 4 to 6 week mark. And so what I always emphasize for someone who's interested in a microdosing protocol is you really have to commit to doing this 2 or 3 times a week for at least a month, if not longer, to start to see some of the outcomes and the results. The parallel that I often draw is like with meditation, right? When you start to meditate, you don't just sit in the cushion for 20 minutes one day and expect that your life is going to change dramatically from that point forward. You know that, okay, if I want to meditate, I need to sit on the cushion every day for 15 to 20 minutes for at least a month. And then after that month, I might start to notice that I'm more patient, I'm less reactive, I'm more creative, I'm more present in my relationship. But it takes that month to sort of retrain the patterns of the brain and the body. And microdosing is similar. You want to commit to doing it at least for a month. And as part of that, have an intention that is sort of driving the work. Because what I always say is microdosing is not a magic pill, it's a catalyst. It helps to support something called neuroplasticity, which allows the brain to change and become malleable. But a lot of its efficacy is determined by what new patterns or habits are you committing to that are also going to help you in the long term. That could be exercising more, it could be meditating more often, or starting to do something like breath work or yoga. It could be, a lot of people find that they start to cut out toxic relationships in their life, or maybe they've been in a job that they hate and they're like, okay, this is causing me a lot of distress. I need to, quit that job. So there's sort of awareness of, okay, these are the things that are holding me back. These are the things that are not making me well. These are the things that keep me stuck in a small, tight, constricted place. And microdosing acts as an opening, as a catalyst to start to change some of those practices and behaviors. And the typical dose I mentioned with mushrooms, it's about 100 milligrams of mushrooms. With LSD, it tends to be about 10 micrograms of LSD. And this is still largely illegal, right? As we talked about, in the Netherlands, mushrooms are legal. In Colorado and Oregon, these are legal. But in most other places in the Western world, these are illegal. However, that's not really stopping people, is what we've noticed. There was a statistic that was published this year that in the United States last year, in 2023, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms. And about 47% of those people, almost 4 million people, were microdosing with psilocybin mushrooms. And so it's happening. People are getting behind it. And the challenge right now, as people are starting to access this medicine, you mentioned gummies at the beginning of the show. Unfortunately, because it's in this, let's say, gray area, a lot of people don't know what they're getting. So they might buy a chocolate or a gummy, and on that, on that package, it might say, oh, psilocybin mushrooms is in here. But sometimes people put synthetics instead of psilocybin mushrooms. And so it's really important that if someone is to work with mushrooms, that they either grow their own mushrooms or that they find a trusted source. And so at Third Wave on our website, we have a sourcing guide, and we have other resources for people that are vetted and trustworthy, because we know people are going to do this, and we want to make sure that if they do it, they can do it in a safe and effective way.
Well, it's important to say that you've been training a lot of advisors, and you have your close group on the third wave, and you actually enabled over 25 million people globally. So that is not a small number. And so
Mhm.
before we go into the things I deal with every day, insurance and pharma and corporates, let's go first into talking a psychedelic and the power of it for professional growth and leadership. So I believe that I read that you're using and leveraging psychedelics, right, for professional empowerment and enhancing leadership ability. Can you explain how does that work, and how do you help business leaders to become better leaders?
So we talked a lot about the medical and the therapeutic use of psychedelics in terms of how it can help depression, PTSD, addiction, all of which are very important for mental health. But there are a lot of people who are, let's say, healthy normals who don't have a clinical indication who could still benefit from working with psychedelics. In fact, what a lot of people don't know is in the second wave of psychedelics, which was in the 50s and 60s, the counterculture, if you will, there was a lot of clinical research done on LSD. And some of that clinical research was done in Palo Alto at Stanford University in the early 50s. And what happened is there was a guy named Ken Kesey who wrote a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a really famous book and also now a famous movie with Jack Nicklaus and several others. And Ken Kesey took LSD out of the lab in Stanford and started to distribute it in that Silicon Valley area. And so there's a really distinct and direct relationship between the early use of LSD and the birth of cyberculture. And we all have probably heard it at this point, but Steve Jobs had even said, LSD was one of the most impactful things that he had ever done. And of course, Apple is now responsible for a lot of the technology and the personal computer revolution that we live in today. So, what's happening when a healthy normal takes a psychedelic? Well, a recent study was just published maybe a week ago that showed that 28 people were given a high dose of psilocybin, healthy normals, and it showed that it actually physically changed the structure of their brain, that it helped to create new neuronal connections, it helped the two hemispheres of the brain to better communicate, and they found that it helped people to feel more connected, to have an overall sense of better well-being, and it helped them to it was one of the most sort of profound or interesting experiences of their lives. And so there's a direct relationship then between that sort of consciousness expansion and creativity. And so especially, we're recording this in October 2024. AI, artificial intelligence, is all the rage at this point in
Mhm.
time. And the expectation is that in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, AI will take over a lot of the rote tasks that we do on an everyday basis. And so in the past, in the professional world, a lot of the value that was created was if you could get things done, if you could go through a list and you could do X, Y, and Z. And this is what we call convergent thinking. You know what needs to get done, just focus on getting it done. What's becoming more valuable in corporate, entrepreneurial, professional environments is the capacity to think divergently,
Mhm.
to sort of look at how two separate ideas, there might be a synthesis between those two. And so psychedelics are becoming increasingly used by founders and entrepreneurs because it's helping them to problem solve. It's helping them to come up with creative solutions, first and foremost. Now, the other thing that we notice psychedelics help with is a feeling of empathy, a feeling of vulnerability, a better ability to communicate things. And so the vision, the creativity, that's important for solving external problems. But half the battle in running any organization is the relationship that one has with their team, with the people that are reporting to them, with the people that they're managing. And so people also find that when they start to work with psychedelics, they communicate more authentically, they communicate more vulnerably, they communicate more compassionately. And so psychedelics are also helping leaders to be more seen and heard and understood. And I think that is invaluable, especially in this new world, because it's not so much work is not nearly as much about can you just check things off a box anymore. Work is now about can we solve some of humanity's biggest problems, and can we do that with people that we really respect, who are highly intelligent and who want to join us for this mission in the external world.
So it's interesting to hear you speak, Paul, because last week I was at a conference in Las Vegas called ITC Vegas, which is an insurance conference, 10,000 people coming together. One of our main speaker was Zach Cass, formerly head of go-to-market strategy at OpenAI. And we talk, as you would expect, about AI. But the interesting thing about the conversation is the divergence, right? The divergent issue you just highlighted is we are going into an artificial intelligence world where technology has to be combined with societal values. And, we are scared about that job displacement, but actually we are going to go for an identity displacement, which I believe a lot in, because I've done a lot of work around helping executive work around their authentic identity. Being one of many is very hard, but being one of uniqueness and differentiation is easier because you have the creativity, the problem-solving skill, and the ability to actually look at, design thinking, right? A big problem and solve them differently by looking at divergence. And so going back to that, do you have some examples you can share with us as to how you've helped founders, executives, people get into, rebuilding their brains in some ways to become the leaders they have become to be today?
So the most common client that I work with are often people who are going through transition. So I'll give an example of one. One of the clients that I worked with a few years ago was high up at Meta, which used to be called Facebook, of course. And she found that there was a lot of talk about conscious leadership or conscious living, but there wasn't a lot of actual action in some of these big tech companies. And it was really disillusioning for her. And so she chose to quit that job. And soon after she quit, they found me on LinkedIn through a podcast, and we started to work together. And I really helped to coach her through that personal transition of aligning with work. And it's actually her true identity, back to sort of working with that true identity, that authentic identity. Because a lot of us, as we get into the professional work environment, we are driven by success, achievement, ego, and that conditioning usually comes from our parents. It comes from our culture. It comes from things outside of us. And so when people start to go through transformational experiences with psychedelics, they often come to recognize and realize that, oh, I'm doing all these things, not because I actually want to do it, but because, my dad encouraged me to become a lawyer, or, that professor I had said I had to go to medical school and become a doctor, or whatever else it might be. And so when we work with these psychedelics, it helps us to come into a deeper relationship with ourselves. And so the woman that I was supporting, she transitioned out of Meta, took about 6 months to a year, which I know not everyone has, but she was fortunate that she had some time, and now is doing full-time coaching. And she coaches people in helping to work with psychedelics. She coaches other leaders through transformational processes. And so I find that often is one of the types of clients that I work with. The other type of client that I work with from time to time are executives or founders who are looking to become more conscious and aware themselves, and then figure out how can that be woven into the organizational fabric that they are either building or they are sort of managing and responsible for. And that can be one of the bigger challenges, that, as we know, every leader has, let's say, a bioenergetic field, that the work that they do, the way they show up, it ripples across their organization. And so as someone may work with psychedelics, they come into this awakening, they come to this realization, but how they actually translate that into more conscious business practices can be difficult. And this is what we call integration. And so a lot of the clients that I work with, I'll help support them after, okay, you've had this big, profound experience. You started to work with psychedelics. You become aware of X, Y, and Z. Now, how do you treat the people that you work with differently? How might you set up a different structure in HR for, time off? How might the culture of your company change as a result of some of these insights and downloads that you've had? How might you roll out a new product or service using design thinking, for example, with psychedelics as a tool that helps to access some of those more abstract ways of thinking? So I would say those are the two most common folks that I work with: people who are transitioning, they're in a point of transition, or those who they love what they do, but they know that there are changes that need to occur for their business to thrive at an even higher level.
Have you ever had a circumstance where you may have a group of executives, right? Entrepreneurs, business builders, trying to reconnect with themselves and the business, doing this together, right? Coming together and getting into a session to build the next wave of companies? Have you experienced that ever?
I've worked with a few very small teams. I would say the people, the groups that are best equipped for that might be pre-seed, seed, or Series A founders that are still very tight and aligned. So instead of taking entire executive teams, work with CEOs of multiple companies and create community and experiences that way. Because a lot of these CEOs, as many CEOs know, it's very lonely at the top, right? And so as they start to come into this deeper transformative work, it's often helpful to be in relationship with other CEOs who are also navigating a similar frame. So I find that to be more commonplace. We've done work with some very early stage organizations, but as they get bigger, and because these are still largely illegal and there's a lot of stigma and bias still around them, if the CEO wants to do it, but the COO doesn't, that could create some challenge in the organization itself. So it's still early stage, but I would say that's part of my vision for the next 10 years is how could we work with more organizations to help them step into more of a conscious leadership frame through psychedelic work. And I think that'll become easier as more people are educated and aware of how to use these responsibly.
What's your view on the main misconceptions around those?
I would say the main misconceptions are that they are illegal drugs, and most illegal drugs are dangerous, like cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. I would say another misconception is that, one of the main powers of psychedelics is they're a pattern interrupt. So they really shake up the snow globe of your mind, and sometimes that can be destabilizing. And so a lot of people in business, they're still very focused on convergent thinking, doing it, the way that it's always been done. And so you have some folks, especially in more traditional industries like law or finance or maybe insurance or accounting, that are not yet open to what that could facilitate. So I think as more states legalize, in fact, in this we have an upcoming election cycle, which I'm sure most people know of because it's all over the news all the time. But the state of Massachusetts has a bill that they're looking to, or a proposal that they're looking to vote on, which would legalize psychedelics in Massachusetts as well. So it's slow, but it's happening. And I would say within the next 3 or 4 years, the FDA will also approve a few more psychedelics for clinical issues. So my expectation would be maybe in 5, 6, 7 years, we can start to weave this into more business environments. But until then, I'm content with those who are already called to this and feel like, okay, this could be helpful and supporting them in that process.
So fascinating. So let's look into opportunities. We talked a bit about opportunity challenges already, but let's look into the next version of it, looking at it from a much more corporate angle. So when we think about the industry itself, it faces, a lot of regulations and, as you mentioned already, societal challenges. So where do you see the big hurdles? Where do you see maybe also the big opportunity when we start thinking about what does that mean for the world and us as individuals?
Yeah, I would say the biggest hurdle still is recognizing that these have been used for thousands of years and that they've been safe and effective for that period of time. And so a lot of people look at psychedelics as this brand new thing when in fact we've been using them for, thousands of years as a human species. And over that time, there's been rituals and traditions and ways of working with these substances that have been well established. So I think the first hurdle to overcome is recognizing that there is a skill to this. And if it's done skillfully, it can be transformative. And if it's not done skillfully, there are risks. It can really set someone back. And so I think that nuance is important. I think the other main nuance is, talking about corporations and big pharmaceutical companies, a lot of big pharma, especially for mental health, thrives on keeping people on Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro and Ritalin and Adderall. And so if you
And we have
introduce
seen the
a
opioid situation
substance
as well, right, Paul?
that's been awful. Yeah. So if you you introduce a substance like psychedelics that can actually help to get to the root cause of it, that is a massive paradigm change in how we approach healing, where it's not just take a pill to fix yourself, but it really requires more effort and more work with a therapist or a psychiatrist or even a coach. So I think that's the other big hurdle, is the reframe that mental health is not just about taking a pill. Mental health is about recognizing our sovereignty, our agency, our capacity for choice and creativity, and that psychedelics can help us bring us into that. But the entire sort of mental health system that we built is an old paradigm. And so psychedelics represent this new paradigm. Whenever a new paradigm is introduced, like we've seen with Tesla and electric cars, right? It started slow and then it built up, and now Teslas are everywhere, and it's one of the highest market cap companies. And I think psychedelics are at a similar phase where it's still very young and very early, but I would expect 10 years from now that they will become the sort of predominant intervention from a mental health perspective. But that's going to require a lot more time and energy, a lot more research to ensure that that is done in a safe and effective way.
And what about insurance? I'm in insurance, so I think the insurance executive might be listening to that. It's like, oh, what is Sabine's doing here now? But I think it's something we just need to be aware of. And I remember one of my partner travelers in the United States did actually a session in marijuana a few months ago to actually create awareness around the usage of marijuana. So how do you envision the role of insurance, for instance, as part of this ecosystem building?
So the best example of that is, Johnson and Johnson patented a form of ketamine called Spravato, and that is now covered by insurance, and it's a $1 billion product at this point in time. So insurance requires FDA approval for the most part, and so there are some insurance companies that are starting to get into this. For example, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna. These are two companies that are currently covering ketamine assisted psychotherapy for individuals, but we won't really see that happen in a substantial way until the FDA approved psilocybin for depression or LSD for anxiety, and I wouldn't expect that to happen until 2026, 2027. But insurance companies are exploring this; they're looking at it, they're curious about it, but they still want to see more scientific research, and most importantly, they want to see FDA approval before they're going to come in and cover this in a widespread way.
Yeah, makes sense. And so with, I think, over $2 billion invested in psychedelic, what's your view from an investor viewpoint and for the future of entrepreneurship?
So it's a great question. So that number has now increased. I think $3.5 billion has been invested in the last 5 years in psychedelics. 95% of that has been into biotech, so doing clinical trials and clinical research with psychedelics. I think that will still be the predominant form of investing in the psychedelic space. But then you have other investors who are starting clinics. They're investing in software. They're investing in other forms that help to create this healthcare infrastructure for psychedelics. And so the expectation is by 2027 or 2028 that the industry will be worth about 10 billion. And I would expect we'll see another 2 to 3 to $4 billion invested over the next 4 to 5 years. And it's necessary because whenever you're building something from scratch, like we are with this new paradigm of mental health care, it requires a lot of that upfront investment. And so I'm all for it. And what I believe is just as important is that we support state regulation. We support local decriminalization of these substances, because I think it's a both and world. We can both have mental health care in clinics to help with these things, but there's also a lot of communities and churches that are simply working with psilocybin mushrooms outside of those environments, and people are finding a lot of healing from that as well. So I think it is a both and perspective, and I'm really supportive of, the more investment, the better at this point in time, because it can help to build this entire ecosystem.
Yeah, as you are speaking, I was thinking about having my Vision Pro on and then maybe a little bit of mushroom and actually defining my next big idea and building the next $1 billion company. But anyway, until we get there,
I like it.
Oh, looking ahead. So what is your vision for the future, right? Into us integrating this as part of our personal and professional lives to actually do better, right? Tech needs to do better. People needs to do better for life. What would be your recommendations?
So I think first and foremost would be education, right? Just We need more education. People are quite illiterate when it comes to psychedelics. So I really emphasize more education, both for the layperson, but also for the medical professionals, the doctors and therapists and clinicians who are starting to look at this. Education is really key. I think the second component is ethical providers. That it's really important that we train, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, where we're training practitioners in how to work with psychedelics, because this movement will become that much more successful and effective as more professionals are trained to facilitate psychedelic experiences. So the second thing is providers, and the third thing is community. That a lot of the healing potential of these medicines comes from the relationship with others, and that we talked about this already with COVID-19 and the mental health crisis. A lot of that is catalyzed through isolation and disconnection. And so I think the other key component of this is ensuring that there is a community of support. There are people who you can talk to, who you can be understood by. And so those three aspects, education, providers, and community, that's what we're supporting through Third Wave and the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And I think those are the three important pillars of integrating psychedelics into our cultural framework.
Cool. Austin, thank you very much for joining me on Scouting for Growth. So if people want to find out about Third Wave and all the work you are doing, where should they go?
Just go to thethirdwave.co. I'm also on Instagram at PaulAustin3W. I post on Twitter as well, and I'm active on LinkedIn. And then if folks want to learn more about me, if someone's listening to this and they also want maybe some one-to-one support or a coach or practitioner who can help them, just go to paulaustin.co, and folks can find out more about my personal work there.
Thank you, Paul, for joining me on Scouting for Growth.
Thank you, Sabine.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Scouting for Growth. Please subscribe, share with friends, and leave a 5-star rating. Your rating is so valuable. I review all of them, and my team help me adapt content to meet your needs. Also, connect with me on my preferred channels. I am a B2B growth expert, so you will find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Threads, and X as well as Blue Sky. All information available below. Until next, keep scouting for growth.